The floorboards shouldn't have sounded hollow. Thomas Vickery had paced that parlour 1,000 times over his 43 years, familiar with every creak, every groan, every uneven plank in the old plantation house. Yet on that stifling August afternoon in 1862, with the smoke of distant fires curling into the sky and Confederate troops retreating through the county, something was unmistakably wrong. Thomas froze mid-step, his boot pressing against a board near the fireplace. The sound it made was not the familiar protest of aged wood under weight. It was emptiness, a hollow void where solid foundation should have been. From the doorway, his wife Martha watched him, hands knotted in her apron. "Thomas, we should be packing," she urged. "The Union soldiers will be here by nightfall," he muttered, but he was no longer listening. Kneeling, Thomas traced the edges of the suspect board with trembling fingers. What he found was not a natural flaw in the wood, but a precise, deliberate seam, carefully concealed, expertly crafted. "Go fetch the prying tool from the barn," he said quietly. "Quickly, Martha." 20 minutes later, 3 floorboards lay discarded beside him, and Thomas stared down into darkness that had been sealed for who knew how long. A sharp, fetid smell rose from below, sweat, human breath, and something else, alive. He lowered the lantern cautiously. 31 pairs of eyes glinted back from the shadows. Children, ranging from perhaps 4 years old to early adolescence, all of them sat motionless. Their faces were thin, hollowed by hunger and neglect, yet alert. They did not cry. They did not plead. They simply watched, their expressions unreadable, no surprise, no fear, no hope, as if they had always known this day would come. Martha's scream shattered the silence. Neighbors came running, summoned by the sound. Slowly the children were lifted out into the harsh August sunlight. Doctors were called. Authorities were notified. And yet, amid the chaos, one question gnawed at Thomas. How could he, a man born and raised in this house, have never known this hidden room existed? The Vickerys had owned the plantation for 3 generations. Thomas's father had built the house in 1831, and now, in the shadows beneath the familiar parlor floor, a horrific secret had been unearthed. How had these children survived, and who had locked them away? The Vickery plantation sprawled over 200 acres of Mississippi bottomland, 3 miles east of Greenville. Its soil had witnessed countless stories of wealth and suffering, but nothing like this. By August 1862, it was one of the last working estates in the county. Most neighbors had fled as Union forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, but Thomas Vickery had refused to leave. His father had built this land into prosperity, and Thomas had continued that legacy. Even with the war consuming the nation, even with half his field workers gone and the cotton market collapsed, Thomas remained. What no one knew, not even Thomas himself, until that August afternoon, was that the house had been built with intentions far more complex than anyone had imagined. Dr. Samuel Frost arrived from town within 2 hours of the discovery. He was 70 years old, one of the few physicians who hadn't been conscripted for military service. His hands shook as he examined the children who'd been arranged in the drawing room, each sitting quietly on chairs or the floor, accepting water and bread with mechanical politeness. "I've never seen anything like this," Frost murmured to Thomas, his voice low enough that only the plantation owner could hear. "These children should be dead. Based on what you've described, a sealed room with no apparent ventilation, no apparent food supply. They should have suffocated or starved within days. Yet here they are, malnourished, yes, dehydrated, certainly, but alive, conscious, responsive." Watch the children. They ranged in age from approximately 4 to 13 years old. Some were white, some were mixed race. 2 appeared to be fully black, likely children of slaves from neighboring plantations. Their clothing was simple, homespun, years out of fashion, as if they'd been dressed from another era entirely. "Have any of them spoken?" Thomas asked. "Not a word. They drink when offered water. They eat when given food, but they won't answer questions, won't give their names." It's as if Frost paused, searching for words. It's as if they're waiting for permission to speak. Permission from whom? The old doctor had no answer. That evening, as Martha worked with 2 remaining house servants to prepare beds for the children, Thomas returned to the hidden room beneath the parlor. He brought 3 lanterns and a profound sense of unease. The space was larger than he'd initially realized. The opening in the parlor floor was narrow, barely wide enough to lower a child through, but the room itself extended nearly 15 feet in every direction. The ceiling was just over 5 feet high. An adult would have to crouch, but a child could stand comfortably. The walls were brick, expertly constructed. The floor was packed earth covered in scattered straw that looked decades old, and along one wall, carved into the brick with what must have been painstaking effort, were words, "Shepherd's Hold." 1839. Thomas's blood went cold. 1839, 8 years after his father had built this house, which meant his father had known about this room, had perhaps even ordered its construction. But why? He searched the space methodically. There was a ventilation shaft, ingeniously hidden, barely 3 in diameter, that appeared to run up through the walls and exit somewhere near the roof. Too narrow for a person to climb through, but sufficient for air circulation. There was evidence of water collection, a copper basin positioned beneath what looked like a condensation system channeling moisture from the walls, and there were markings on the floor. Chalk lines, mostly faded, forming a pattern. Thomas studied them in the lantern light, trying to make sense of the design. It looked like a grid or a map, with 31 small circles arranged in precise positions, exactly the number of children they'd found. By the second day, word of the discovery had spread throughout what remained of Greenville's civilian population. The war had emptied the town. Most young men were fighting. Most families had evacuated, but those who remained were desperate for distraction from the daily grind of survival. The mystery of the 31 children became the only topic of conversation. Sheriff James Polk arrived on the morning of August 23rd. He was 64 years old, too old for military service, but too stubborn to abandon his post. The badge on his chest was tarnished, and his eyes held the exhaustion of a man who'd seen his entire world collapse. "I need to interview them," Polk said, standing in the vicary drawing room, looking at the children who sat in neat rows, their faces expressionless. "Someone must be missing these children. Families must be searching." "They won't speak," Dr. Frost said. He'd stayed at the plantation, fascinated and disturbed by the medical impossibility before him. "We've tried everything. Direct questions, gentle coaxing, even trying to frighten responses out of them. Nothing works." "They understand English?" Polk asked. "Oh, yes. They follow instructions perfectly. If you tell them to stand, they stand. To sit, they sit, but they won't speak on their own initiative." Thomas watched from the corner of the room. He barely slept since the discovery. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 31 faces staring up at him from the darkness, and he kept returning to the same impossible questions. How had they survived, and why had his father built that room? "I've been going through my father's papers," Thomas said quietly, "his correspondence, his financial records, his journals, looking for any mention of this situation." And Polk turned to him. "Nothing explicit. But there are gaps, periods in 1839 and 1840, where he made no entries in his daily journal. That was unusual for him. He was meticulous about record-keeping, and there are several payments made to a construction contractor from Natchez. Large payments, but no description of what was being built. The name of this contractor? Henry Cutler, but I've made inquiries. He died in 1847, yellow fever." Polk swore under his breath. "Convenient. One of the children." N, a girl of perhaps 9 years old with dark hair and hollow cheeks, suddenly turned her head to look directly at Thomas. Her eyes were grey, unsettlingly clear. She held his gaze for several seconds, and Thomas felt something cold slide down his spine. Then, without changing expression, the girl reached into the pocket of her worn dress and withdrew something small. She held it out toward Thomas, her arm extended, her hand open. It was a coin, tarnished silver. Thomas crossed the room and took it from her palm. The metal was cold despite being held against her body. He turned the coin over in his fingers. It was a Spanish real dated 1792 and scratched into one side, barely visible, were initials J.V. John Vicary, Thomas's father. The girl's hand dropped back to her lap. She turned away, her expression unchanged, as if the exchange had meant nothing at all. "Where did you get this?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. The girl said nothing. "Please, I need to understand. Where did this come from?" Still nothing. Dr. Frost stepped forward, his medical curiosity overriding his caution. "Can you tell us your name, any of you, please? We're trying to help." The children remained silent. Polk sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. "This is impossible. 31 children don't just disappear without anyone noticing. There would be records, missing person reports, families searching something. Unless," Dr. Frost said slowly, "they disappeared a very long time ago." The three men looked at each other, the implications settling over them like a shroud. "The room was built in 1839, Thomas said. 23 years ago. These children should have aged. The youngest should be in their late 22nd. Why now? The oldest would be in their mid-30s, but they're still children." "That's medically impossible," Frost whispered. "Then explain what we're seeing." "No one could." Martha Vickery was the one who found the ledger. She'd been cleaning out the attic, preparing the house for possible evacuation if Union troops proved hostile, when she discovered a false panel in the back of an old wardrobe. Behind it was a leather-bound book, water-stained and mildewed, but still largely legible. She brought it downstairs, without opening it, her instincts telling her that whatever was written inside needed to be read by her husband first. Thomas took the book to his study and locked the door. When he emerged 3 hours later, his face was the color of ash. "Thomas." Martha touched his arm. "What is it?" He couldn't meet her eyes. "My father, God forgive him. My father was part of something terrible. That evening, with Sheriff Polk and Dr. Frost present, Thomas read selected passages from the ledger aloud. His voice was flat, emotionless, the only way he could get through the words. The ledger was a record, a meticulous, horrifying record. It had begun in 1838. A group of men, plantation owners, businessmen, even 2 local ministers had formed what they called the Shepherd Society. Their stated purpose was noble, to rescue children from desperate situations, orphans from failed homesteads, mixed-race children whose white fathers refused to acknowledge them, children of slaves born with obvious white features who would create uncomfortable questions, children from impoverished families who could no longer feed them. The society would take these children, house them temporarily, and supposedly find them proper homes and futures. But that's not what happened. The ledger contained names, 31 names to be exact, each with a date of acquisition and a brief description. Mary Catherine, age 7, acquired March 1839, daughter of deceased river workers, no known relatives. William, age 5, acquired April 1839. Mixed heritage, mother deceased in childbirth. Samuel Joseph, age 10, acquired June 1839, orphaned when father killed in tavern dispute. The list continued. 31 children, all acquired between March 1839 and January 1841, all listed as having no viable family connections, all conveniently forgotten by a society that had plenty of its own problems to worry about. And then after the 31st name, a final entry in John Vickers' handwriting. "The shepherd's hold is complete. The children are secured. May God forgive what we have done in his name. The project will remain sealed until the appropriate time. Instructions have been left with HC for future activation." "HC," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "Henry Cutler, the contractor. What does until the appropriate time mean?" Polk demanded. "Appropriate for what?" "I don't know. There's nothing else." The ledger ends there. Dr. Frost had gone pale. "You're telling me these children were imprisoned in that room 23 years ago and somehow remain preserved?" "I'm telling you what the ledger says, but the children we've examined aren't 23 years older than they should be. They're exactly the ages listed in this book. A 7-year-old from 1839 is still 7 years old today. That's beyond medicine. That's beyond nature itself." Thomas set the ledger down carefully as if it might shatter. "There's one more thing. On the last page, there's a notation. It says the Shepherd's Hold operates on principles discovered by E.H. in Charleston, 1822. Further documentation held in trust with the Charleston Institute of Natural Philosophy?" A. Polk asked. "I have no idea, Martha had been standing in the doorway listening. Now she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to the other members of this society? The other men involved? Thomas met her eyes, according to my research, all dead. My father died in 1851. The two ministers both died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1853. The other planters, he consulted notes he'd made, various causes, hunting accident, heart failure, pneumonia. The last one died just 2 years ago. All dead, Polk said slowly. And the secret died with them. Except it didn't, because the children were still down there waiting. Waiting for what? Martha demanded. No one had an answer. Over the following days, Thomas became obsessed with understanding the chalk markings on the floor of the hidden room. He spent hours underground copying the pattern onto paper, trying to decipher its meaning. The 31 circles were arranged in a specific formation, not random, not chaotic. There was a logic to their placement, though Thomas couldn't grasp it. Dr. Frost joined him on the 4th day after the discovery. The old physician moved slowly, his joints complaining as he lowered himself through the narrow opening in the parlor floor. "You should see them," Frost said, settling onto the packed earth floor. "The children, they're beginning to change." Thomas looked up from his sketches. "Change how?" "They're aging, or rather, they're catching up. It's subtle. Most people wouldn't notice, but I've been examining them twice daily. The just ones are showing signs of growth, literally growing. One of the boys has gained nearly half an inch in height since we found them, and their behavior is shifting. They're becoming more responsive, more present. Are they speaking? Not yet. But I believe they will soon. Whatever was keeping them suspended is wearing off." Thomas turned back to the chalk pattern. "This formation, I've been comparing it to everything I can think of. Crop rotation patterns, military formations, constellation maps. Nothing matches. Maybe it's not meant to match anything external," Frost suggested. "Maybe it's internal, a pattern meant only for this specific purpose." What purpose? What were they trying to accomplish? Frost was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was troubled. "I've been practicing medicine for 45 years. I've seen things that challenge explanation, diseases that shouldn't exist, recoveries that defy logic. But this, Thomas, what if your father and his associates stumbled onto something real, something that could suspend human development, stop time for a living being? That's impossible. So is what we're witnessing, yet here we are." Thomas set down his papers. There was a notation in the ledger about someone named A. in Charleston, 1822, and the Charleston Institute of Natural Philosophy. I know the institute. Frost said it was a research organization operated in the 1820s and 30s, focused on unconventional sciences, the sort of things respectable academics wouldn't touch. They were shut down in 1837 after some sort of scandal. What kind of scandal? I don't recall the details, but there were rumors about human experimentation, attempts to manipulate natural processes, the kind of whispers that get men run out of town. Thomas felt that cold certainty settling over him again. My father was experimenting on those children, perhaps. Or perhaps he thought he was saving them. The ledger said they were rescuing children from desperate situations. What if they believed they were preserving these children until a better time, a better circumstance, by locking them in a hole in the ground for 23 years? Frost had no response that evening. One of the children finally spoke. It was the dark-haired girl who'd given Thomas the coin. She was sitting in the drawing room with the others, eating a modest dinner of bread and broth, when she suddenly looked up at Martha and said in a voice rusty from disuse, "Where is the shepherd?" The room went silent. Everyone stared. Martha knelt beside the girl's chair. "What did you say, sweetheart? Where is the shepherd?" the girl repeated. Her grey eyes were clearer now, more focused. "He told us he would return. He promised. When the time was right, he would come back for us." "Who is the shepherd?" Martha asked gently. "The man who brought us here. The man who said we would be safe, that we would sleep, and when we woke, everything would be better." The girl's expression flickered, the first sign of emotion anyone had seen from her. "But everything is not better. The world is still sick. We can feel it." Thomas entered the room, his heart pounding. "What is your name?" The girl looked at him. Mary Catherine, I am 7 years old. I've been 7 years old for a very long time." Once Mary Catherine spoke, the others began following her lead, slowly, haltingly, as if remembering how language worked. The children started to commune. "I, Kate." Their stories were consistent. All had been brought to the Vickery plantation between 1839 and 1841. All had been told they were being saved from difficult circumstances. All had been given something to drink, a bitter tea that made them drowsy and led down into the hidden room. "The shepherd told us to lie down," said a boy named William, perhaps 6 years old. "He said we would sleep, and it would be like closing our eyes and opening them in a better world. He said God was going to fix everything, but it would take time. So we had to wait here where time wouldn't touch us." "And you just slept?" Dr. Frost asked, his medical mind struggling with the impossibility. "We did more than sleep," Mary Catherine said. "We were there, but also not there. Like being in a dream, but knowing you're dreaming. We could hear things sometimes, voices above us, footsteps, but we couldn't move, couldn't wake up." Not until the floor opened and the light came in. Sheriff Polk had been taking notes. Now he looked up, his face grim. "This shepherd, did he ever tell you his real name?" The children shook their heads. "Can you describe him?" "Old," said Mary Catherine. "With white hair and a kind voice, he wore nice clothes. He smelled like tobacco and peppermint." Thomas felt his stomach turn. That was his father. John Vickery had always carried peppermint candies in his pockets and smoked a pipe. "Every evening he would visit us," another girl added. Her name was Sarah. "Before we went to sleep, he would read to us from the Bible. He would tell us we were special, that we'd been chosen for something important." "Chosen for what?" Thomas asked. "He never said exactly. Just that we were going to help yield a better world. A world without the sickness that was destroying everything." Dr. Frost leaned forward. "What sickness?" The children exchanged glances as if consulting some shared memory. "The sin sickness," Mary Catherine finally said. "That's what the shepherd called it. He said the world was eating itself because people had forgotten how to be good, how to be pure, and that by the time we woke up, enough time would have passed that the sickness would have run its course, that we would emerge into a world that had been cleansed. Cleansed how, past? He never said, but he seemed very certain it would happen." Thomas thought about the timeline. 1839 to 1862. "This has implications beyond this plantation, beyond this war. If what you're telling me is true, if these children were successfully placed in some kind of suspended animation, then the science involved could change everything. Military applications alone, no." Thomas stepped forward, his voice hard. "These children are not military assets. They're not experiments. They're people who have suffered enough. I understand your protective instinct, Mr. Vickery, but this is bigger than your personal feelings. This could save lives. If we could replicate what was done here—" "It killed 7 children before it succeeded with 31, Martha interrupted. "Would you be willing to kill dozens more in the name of replicating it?" Sinclair had no answer. Major Sinclair ordered the children to be moved to a military medical facility in Memphis. Thomas and Martha protested violently, but they had no legal standing. The children were effectively wards of the state, and the state was now under Union military control. The separation happened on September 3rd. The children were loaded into wagons, their few belongings packed into small bags. They went quietly, without protest, but Mary Catherine stopped before boarding her wagon and looked back at Thomas. "Thank you for opening the chamber," she said. "Even though the world wasn't ready, even though we're not sure we should have woken, you freed us, and we'll remember that." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his throat tight. "I'm sorry for what my father did, and I'm sorry I can't protect you from what comes next. You did what you could. That's more than the shepherd ever did." She climbed into the wagon. As the convoy pulled away from the plantation, Thomas felt Martha's hand slip into his. They stood together, watching the dust cloud recede into the distance, knowing they'd probably never see those children again. "What will happen to them?" Martha asked. "I don't know, but I pray they find some kind of peace." The Union Military Medical Facility in Memphis was a former hospital, now repurposed for treating wounded soldiers and conducting medical research relevant to the war effort. The 31 children were installed in a separate wing, isolated from the regular patients. Dr. Jonathan Myers was assigned as their primary physician. He was 42, educated at Harvard Medical School, and considered one of the finest medical minds in the Union. His initial reports to his superiors expressed profound skepticism about the claims surrounding the children. Within a week, that skepticism had transformed into obsessive fascination. His detailed examinations confirmed everything Dr. Frost had documented and revealed even more anomalies. The children's blood was slightly thicker than normal. Our bone density was unusual. Not quite as dense as adult bones, but denser than typical children's bones. Most remarkably, their cells showed almost no signs of aging at the microscopic level. It's as if their bodies exist in a state of perpetual renewal, Myers wrote in his confidential report to the military command. Every cell is constantly being refreshed, repaired, maintained. Normal human aging occurs because this repair process gradually becomes less efficient. But in these subjects, the efficiency appears constant. They're not immortal. They can be injured and presumably killed, but natural cellular degradation seems to have been halted. The military's interest intensified. Questions came from Washington. Could the process be replicated? What were the military applications? Could it be used to preserve wounded soldiers until proper medical treatment could be administered? Dr. Myers was ordered to determine the mechanism of action, which meant experiments. He started carefully. Blood samples, tissue samples, observation of healing processes. But as weeks passed and pressure from his superiors increased, the experiments became more invasive. He administered various substances to see how the children's altered biology would respond. He induced minor injuries to study their healing. He subjected them to temperature extremes to test their resilience. The children endured it all with that same quiet acceptance they'd shown since awakening. They answered questions. They complied with instructions. They showed no resistance except Mary Catherine. On October 15th, during a particularly uncomfortable examination, she looked directly at Dr. Myers and said, "You're just Ike the shepherd, justifying cruelty by calling it science." Myers froze. "I'm not being cruel. I'm trying to understand." The shepherd said the same thing. "Understanding requires sacrifice," he said. "The 7 who died were unfortunate but necessary. That's what you're thinking, isn't it? That we're valuable resources, that a little suffering now could save many lives later. These tests aren't causing you significant harm. They're causing us to lose what little humanity we have left. We're becoming specimens, objects the same way we were objects to the shepherd, innocents to be preserved, tools for his vision of a better world." Myers set down his instruments. "What would you have me do? Ignore the potential value of understanding your condition? I would have you treat us as people, not as medical curiosities. We didn't ask for this. We didn't volunteer to be experiments. We were children stolen from desperate situations and transformed into things that aren't quite human anymore. And now, instead of being allowed to discover what we are on our own terms, we're being studied and tested and treated like animals in a laboratory." The doctor had no response. That night, Mary Catherine spoke with the other children. They gathered in the large room where they slept, all 31 beds arranged in rows, and she explained what she believed was happening. "They're trying to extract the shepherd's secret to recreate what was done to us, which means they'll keep testing us, pushing us, seeing how far our bodies can be driven. It will never stop. Not as long as we're here." "Choice do we have?" asked William. "We're children. We have no money, no families, no legal rights. We're prisoners." "We have one advantage," Mary Catherine said quietly. "We're not normal children. The compound changed us. We're stronger than we look. We heal faster. We can endure things others can't. And we're connected. The chamber linked us. We can feel each other even when separated. That's our strength." "What are you suggesting?" asked Sarah. "I'm suggesting we leave tonight, all of us, before they do something we can't recover from." "They'll hunt us," Daniel pointed out. "The military doesn't just let valuable assets walk away. Then we disappear. We scatter 31 children going in 31 directions. They can't track all of us." "And go where?" Rebecca asked. "Do what?" Mary Catherine's grey eyes were steady. "We survive, we adapt, we learn what we are, and maybe eventually we find out if there were any others. If the Shepherd or Ezra Harper created any other groups, if we're truly alone in what we've become, or if there are more like us somewhere in this broken world, they escaped on October 23, 1862, a moonless night with clouds covering the stars. The facility's security was focused on preventing Confederate raids, not on containing children. The guards never imagined that anyone would want to flee the safety of Union protection. The 31 moved silently, having planned every step. They split into small groups, never more than 3 together, and dispersed into Memphis, then beyond. Some headed north into Illinois, others west toward Arkansas. A few went south back toward Mississippi. They'd agreed to leave no trail, to use different names, to blend into the chaos of wartime America, where displaced children were common and records were unreliable. By the time Dr. Myers discovered them missing the next morning, they were already scattered across 3 states. The military launched an investigation. Search parties were dispatched. Descriptions were circulated. But in the chaos of 1862, with armies moving across the country and civilian populations in constant flux, 31 missing children were ultimately just another tragedy among thousands. Major Sinclair wrote in his final report, "The subjects disappeared during the night of October 23rd. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace has been found. It is my assessment that they have likely perished due to exposure, starvation, or violence. The war has made this region extremely dangerous for unprotected children. I recommend closing the investigation and focusing resources on the war effort." But Sinclair didn't believe his own words. In a private letter to a friend, he wrote, "Those children were not normal. Whatever was done to them made them into something else. I don't think they perished. I think they're out there, somewhere, surviving in ways we can't imagine, and I'm not sure if that's comforting or terrifying." Thomas Vickery died in 1871, 9 years after discovering the hidden chamber. He never learned what happened to the 31 children. He spent his remaining years documenting everything he'd witnessed, compiling a complete record of his father's involvement in the Shepherd Society. Before his death, he donated all his research to the Library of Congress with strict instructions. The documents were to be sealed for 50 years, not to be opened until 1921, when hopefully enough time would have passed that the truth could be examined without hysteria. Martha outlived him by 12 years. She never remarried. She spent our final years reaching out to orphanages and children's homes across the South, trying to find any trace of the children who'd been taken in 1839. She found none. It was as if they'd never existed. Dr. Samuel Frost lived until 1879. His medical journals, discovered after his death, contained extensive notes on the children's condition. Modern doctors who've read them remain baffled. Some dismiss them as elaborate fiction. Others wonder if Frost had documented something genuinely extraordinary. Sheriff James Polk survived the war and the Reconstruction period. He died in 1883, taking his secrets to the grave. His official records never mentioned the hidden chamber or the children. As far as his public legacy was concerned, nothing unusual ever happened at the Vickery Plantation. The house itself burned in 1891. A fire of unknown origin consumed the structure completely. When new owners rebuilt on the site, they found the hidden chamber during excavation. By then, the story had become local legend, a ghost tale about children who slept beneath the earth. No one took it seriously, but throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, there were scattered reports across America. Strange children who never seemed to age, who appeared in towns, stayed briefly then vanished, who showed unusual abilities, healing rapidly from injuries, surviving conditions that should have killed them, demonstrating knowledge beyond their apparent years. Most of these reports were dismissed as folklore, tall tales, the kind of stories communities tell to entertain themselves, but occasionally a report would include specific details. A description of a girl with grey eyes who called herself Mary, Catherine, and claimed to be 7 years old, though people swore they'd seen someone matching her description 20 years earlier, looking exactly the same. A boy named William, who worked odd jobs in western frontier towns, never staying more than a few months, always moving before people started asking why he never grew. A girl named Sarah, who appeared at a Chicago orphanage in 1885 claiming to be 8 years old. The matron swore she'd seen the exact same girl at the exact same orphanage in 1870 giving the same age. Were these the children from the Shepherd's Hold, or just coincidental similarities? The human mind creating patterns where none existed? No one could say for certain. In 1921, when Thomas Vickers' sealed documents were finally opened, they caused a brief sensation. Newspapers ran stories about the Mississippi mystery and the children who couldn't die. Without physical evidence, without the children themselves, the story remained a historical curiosity, an unsolved puzzle. Researchers tried to uncover the truth. They combed census records, traced descendants of the Shepherd Society, investigated the Charleston Institute of Natural Philosophy. Every lead, however, ran cold. Ezra Harper vanished entirely after 1839. His research was lost. The formula for the compound remained unknown. By the 1930s, the tale had faded into obscurity, reduced to a strange footnote in American history. Yet fragments lingered in archives, in yellowed letters, in forgotten journals, small hints that something extraordinary had occurred in Mississippi in 1862. That 31 children had been altered in ways beyond scientific understanding, and that some might still exist, living lives stretched across decades, perhaps even centuries. The shepherd's intent had been to preserve innocence until the world healed itself, but the world never healed. The moral cleansing John Vickery and his associates had anticipated never arrived. The children awoke to a nation torn by war, then scattered into a broken world. What became of them after 1862 remains unknown. Yet occasionally hints appear in historical records, in old photographs, in stories passed down through generations, glimpses of people who age unnaturally, who appear and vanish without explanation, who carry secrets from another era. Perhaps they are still out there, 31 scattered seeds from a failed experiment, immortal witnesses to a world that never attains purity, forever waiting for a cleansing that will never come. Still 7, 10, or 13 years old, watching decades pass while their bodies refuse to yield to time, the shepherd's greatest success and his most terrible failure. The events described here draw upon archival research and historical documents unsealed in 1921. The Vickery Plantation existed, as did the Charleston Institute of Natural Philosophy. Whether the children themselves were real or a legend that grew from a grain of historical truth remains debated among historians. What is certain is that something did happen in Mississippi in 1862, something witnessed by multiple observers, something that left traces in letters, ledgers, and 7 small graves hidden beneath a secret